Look at inflation or look at any other union contract. 5% raise a year is just not a monumental deal. I don't think
That's
anyone
a
would
pay
say
cut.
that. Yeah.
5% raise a year right now is a pay cut.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Jonah Furman is staff writer and organizer at Labor Notes, and he joins us now to give us the lowdown about what happened last week with the U.S. railroads and what to look for in the coming months. Jonah, thank you for taking the time to talk to us this morning. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Good to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Ben, really quick, I want to make sure that when we play these two clips from Shapiro and Jackson that Jonah's going to be able to hear them. And while we make sure that Ben has that set up, Jonah, before we talk about what happened last week, what the situation was last week with the negotiations and the almost strike, can you help us understand the situation that railroad workers have been in for the past several years?
Yeah, sure. So, I think going back, the big picture thing is a term called precision scheduled railroad, which is basically the rail industry's version of lean production. So if you look at one of the good measures of this is in the past 6 years, something like 25% of rail workers on different lines have been cut. So, do more with less. This is the name of the game. And in the rails, it's much more severe because low functioning rails, while a big deal for the economy, these are monopolies, right? So you can't just set up another rail line. There are 6 carriers involved in national negotiations, but for the most part, they all cover different geographies and they have their own customers, and those are pretty locked in. You can't really just switch to trucks for most of this stuff or to boats for most of this stuff. You basically, businesses have, the supply chain has to rely on freight rail. So freight rail decided a few years ago, it has to do with, trying to squeeze more money out of it. Warren Buffett taking over one of the big companies, for example. They decided we're just going to cut. And we're going to cut staff even if it's dangerous. We're going to cut staff even if service goes down. And they really don't have much to lose in cutting this because there's no competition. No one's going to step in. And unless, this is where we're hitting a choke point, unless somebody speaks up, like the rail workers, or if businesses, there's businesses that are bankrupted by this worse functioning rail system. And it's really been a drop off in the past 5 to 10 years. So that's why we're seeing it come to a head. And this moment in particular has to do with how railroad negotiations work. So they're under these 5-year contracts, except under rail labor law, which is separate from everything else. You basically are used to these extended agreements that they expire, quote unquote, but they remain in place for years. So we're actually 3 years behind when the last contract was up for the railroad workers.
So the biggest issue that you mentioned, or one of the biggest issues that you mentioned, is that that they're cutting staff on the rail lines, and they're cutting staff to even one person operating one of these huge trains. Is that right?
Yeah, this has been a big part of the fight for years. Is the 2-man crews, which is you have the unions and the workers are just fighting to maintain that on a huge locomotive, could be like a 2-mile long train. You have more than one person working. At bare minimum, it's just, what if somebody, passes out or gets sick or anything happens to the one driver? You have just huge. It's hard to express how dangerous that is. Right. But from the company's perspective, they're like, that's a write-off. If there's an accident, that's less likely, and we get to cut half the engineers. So, for them, that's just fat.
And what about and so you spoke to the dangers of that really well, I think. What about the pay issues there? How long has it been since railroad workers got a raise?
Well, there's built-in raises into these contracts. People keep saying this is the most, the biggest raise we've seen in 40 years on the rails. It's 24% over 5 years. So, it's less than 5% a year. It's not, and they keep talking about, it's a 14% raise immediately. Well, yeah, it's partly because they've been out of raises for the past 3 years while the thing's been expired. So, it's interesting. Some rail workers' pay is a big issue. For a good chunk of the workers who are upset, they're sort of like, you're throwing money at the problem, but the problem is that I never have a day off, never see my family. I would trade, I've had people tell me they would trade X amount of dollars just to get time, and whatever that looks like, sick days, more vacation, less punitive scheduling. The part of the issue is that if you take a day off, you're punished for it for 6 months. You can get fired. There's people who have been hospitalized for COVID and face severe discipline to the point of losing their job. So, that kind of, you can't really throw 20 grand at that.
Right.
And something that's really interesting about pay on the rails right now is you'll see these rail companies right now are offering for new employees like $10,000 to $20,000 starting bonuses. And that might sound nice, but what that means is they cannot get people in the door and they cannot keep them. They're willing to throw however much money they have just to trick you into taking this job. And there's a lot of people who qualify and get in and realize, oh, I can't live. Like, I can't see my family. I can't do anything else outside the job.
Can you make a little bit more explicit what those policies are? Because, like you mentioned, for most of these people that we're hearing from, the only people that are actually talking to the workers that are affected by this, which is going to be you, which is going to be Mel Buer and Max Alvarez at The Real News and the Working People podcast. The pay is not even the primary thing. It's that they want time off. They want to be able to not be punished for getting sick or having to go to the hospital. Can you make a little bit more explicit? What are those policies? How much time off, how much sick time do they or don't they get working on the railroads?
Yeah, so I would just say it's complicated. There's 120,000 workers here in all these different unions, different crafts. So different workers have different issues. But the operating crafts, mainly the people who ride on the trains and things like that, and who are on long-term schedules, big travel schedules, things like that, they get no sick days. And they get something like 30 days in the year off. But you need to think of that like regular workers, Monday through Friday, get 2 days for a weekend every week, right? So right there, that's 104 days. They get 30. They don't have 104. There's no weekend. And when you say they don't get it, it doesn't mean that they're working literally every day, but you have to, if you miss a call, you're on call. And if you miss a call, you are very close to getting fired. Now, there was on one of the rail lines, there was this new policy called high vis, which basically is high visibility, meaning you got to be there all the time, that just implemented harsher penalties for missing a call or not being available when you're supposed to be on call, to the point of if you miss it, you could lose your job. You could have it for 20 years and lose your job if you miss a couple calls or you get too sick or you violate this points policy. So essentially, your life as a railroader, especially increasingly as there's less staff available, is you're sitting next to the phone. You can't make a plan that we're going to go out to dinner. You can't make a plan that we're going to go take a trip for a night. I can't visit someone out of state. I might not be able to go to a wedding because you're by the phone and you need to be able to get to the yard in, X amount of time. And if you don't, you're racking up points on your discipline. And if you hit X points, you are out of the job or you are severe, you have to take 6 months with no time off at all. So that's the big picture of it. And on top of that, there's no sick time at all. So that's only days that you can use of your 30, and a lot of them have to be scheduled in advance. There's different rules for different groups, but it can't be like I'm sick and I can't come in. And especially during a pandemic. I mean, what does that mean? It means if you get COVID or think you might have it, there's no option to say I can't come in. The option is you go in and get everyone sick, or you risk your entire job, which is obviously ridiculous in any time, but when there's mass amount of sickness that we're supposedly trying to suppress, so that's the basic situation is you're just on call all the time.
And when you're on call, are you getting paid while you're not working, but you're on call?
No, I mean, I don't know the exact details for people, but it's not like you're on the clock working the job. You could wait for a job for X amount of time. There's also all these details of like, every time you start a trip, you get paid for it. So they make the trips longer and longer. So you have fewer starts, right? Like they manipulate you'll see, for example, one thing you've seen over the past few years, that the trains are getting longer. They're getting 3 or 4 miles long, each train, because they want to hitch as much cargo to each train because they're trying to maximize the scheduling, So you have, there's a lot of complaints about blocked rail crossings. Like you have a rail crossing in a town that a train is just sitting on, either because it's so long that it takes forever to get past it, but also because it's just parked because they don't have enough maintenance guys to come fix it so we can operate again. So you have like roads in small towns that are just blocked by freight cars because they're not hiring enough people to move the cars. So, we are at a level in the industry of just like, people have described it as near collapse,
Right.
not just for the workers' quality of life, but like the supply chain thing is not just factories aren't putting out enough and we can't get supplies from China or whatever it is. It's also, we can't move freight in this country because the companies make more money by not moving freight efficiently than by moving it efficiently.
And speaking some more to this human toll, and then I want to talk about, I want to contrast that with how these companies are doing. But you retweeted a couple people this morning, or this one person twice this morning. And this is on Twitter. It's anonymous, so all those caveats. But this tracks with our understanding of the situation. At Two Person Cruise on Twitter, you retweeted them, Jonah, saying, quote, I missed a call once while I was on call. So I missed a call to go into work while I was on call. I accidentally left my phone on silent. It cost me 15 of my 30 career points. I would have to work 14 days on call in a row 4 times to get those points back. That's 56 days on call to make up for 1 missed call. Railroads think this is okay. And then the other one that he said is, quote, to witness the birth of my child, I took a day off. This is the same person. This is a railroad worker. It cost me 4 of my 30 career points. I had to work 14 days on call to get those points back. Railroads think this is fine and reasonable. And, these are the kinds of things that people are coming out with, like, the railroad is trying to make me not witness the birth of my child. Like that's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, and again, it's like, it's immoral, but it's also a disaster. It's a disaster waiting to happen for the economy, for whatever system you think that the freight rail is supposed to support. You can't run a system like that forever. When this generation of people there's some people who are like, look, I'm pot committed. Things have gotten so much worse in the past 5 years, but I can't get out because this is my whole, I can't possibly switch 20 years into my career, 30 years into my career. But you're not going to get a new generation of railroaders with these conditions. And if you don't get it, and if the companies are incentivized not to get a new generation of railroaders because they want to keep costs down, and half of what they do is just stock buybacks anyway, and they're a monopoly, so they're not going to lose the business. What's the end game here? I mean, you have to have an industry that can run, but no one involved is incentivized to run it, except when we get within 36 hours of a national rail strike.
Right. Yeah, well, so let's talk about the companies then. How, are they similarly sacrificing in order to make sure that consumers get the goods that they need? Are they also, seeing huge hits to their profits, and the executives taking huge pay cuts and working without being able to witness the birth of their child? Are we seeing like a sort of parity here?
None. I mean, none, but also just so you understand, when union negotiations get bad, in the 80s, in the 90s, you would see like big steel companies have huge fights. And part of it was there was actually profits crisis. It's like the industry is dying. So what are we going to do? We're basically fighting over a shrinking pie. The railroad business is hugely profitable. Like I said, it's monopolistic in the sense that there are multiple companies, but they cover different territory, and they run a business that cannot have competition because no one can go set up their own rail line. So profits and in the pandemic, I mean, we just know that there's been huge pressure on the supply chain, which means more business for them and higher rates because there's more desperation for the business, right? So you pit businesses together, the freight rates go up. So no. They've made a ton of money, and they've spent it. A lot of it they've spent on stock buybacks, which makes them more money. The average annual raise for rail executives is something like 14% a year every year. So by any metric, even if you thought that in a time of crisis, people got to tighten the belt or whatever, this is the opposite. We are at a time of massive profit and extra profit for the companies as they reduce costs like crazy, and as their business goes up like crazy at the same time.
Interesting. Okay, so I think this sets the stage for what happened last week. And so we've got workers really, really sacrificing to get consumers their goods, and the people at the top just raking it in, which leads us to the workers coming close to a strike. Coming close. Well, actually, we were coming closer to a lockout than a strike, and I want you to talk about that. But the narrative was about a strike, and that there was a strike averted, and all of this, and so in response to the news, this is what I want to play a couple of clips, one from a national conservative figure and one from a local one, and I want to get your reaction, Jonah, to how what happened last week is how it's being portrayed in the right-wing press. So, Adam, let's play this clip from Ben Shapiro.
Alrighty, and fingers crossed, everything works correctly here.
Prior to an election, unions can hold up the Democrats at gunpoint, and the Democrats will just give away the store. That's exactly what just happened with the railroads.
All right, so Shapiro reckons that the workers just got the whole store with this deal. So that's a pretty interesting take. And Jonah, you've been talking to railroad workers about this deal that was struck, the tentative agreement that the workers have to vote on before we can actually say, a strike was really averted. So we'll get your take on that in just a second. But this is our own local shock jock, Dale Jackson, is on WVNN in Huntsville. Let's see what he says about what happened last week.
Is that things will be more expensive if there is a rail strike. That's the moral of the story, although it's not hard to understand. That is what people are talking about. So that's not what we need. Now, Joe Biden, well, this union is considering striking and causing many problems here in the United States. Joe Biden sits in the union stronghold of Michigan, as I think 2,000 jobs were announced lost yesterday, looks over to the union folks there and says to them, hey, you guys don't make enough money. Hey, you guys don't get enough credit. Hey, you guys are doing a great job. Bernie Sanders in the United States Senate said, hey, give them whatever they want. So, yeah, we've got an interesting bunch of developments happening here in the United States, and it might be worth noting that there are some concerns, but it looks like we have largely avoided what is happening or what could happen here in the United States. So, again, there were some concerns, and those concerns would impact you because raw materials move on this, gasoline moves on this, so all your consumer goods, all your food, all gasoline, all this stuff could potentially have been impacted by this.
He doesn't lay any of the groundwork like we just did about what the executives are getting and what the workers are putting up with. He doesn't do any of this. The workers got a deal, and Democrats love unions, and probably this isn't going to affect you anymore. That's basically what Jackson's segment said. Jonah, how well do those two segments represent what went on last week?
I mean, it's obviously that's going to be their line, but it just doesn't reflect reality. I mean, what we're talking about is a deal that was set in August, that was recommended, right? And then some workers rejected it, some workers had to think about it. And then there were slight improvements made this week that supposedly got us over the line, right? So the deal itself, I mean, there were not radical changes in there. So there was nothing done on scheduling in either of these deals. The new deal from Thursday that everyone's like, oh, save the day. The only thing it changes about attendance is there's some amount of unpaid sick time. Meaning, another way to say that is, if you get sick and go to the doctor, you will not get fired. You won't get paid, but it won't add to the points. And even that, no one has seen language on what that actually means. If you read the releases from the unions, it basically says for certain procedures, it will be removed from the punitive attendance policy. So there's that. And then the only other thing that people have said is one of the highlights of the deal, again, no one's seen it, is a cap on health insurance premiums, which is just to say, they said if your premium goes over $400 a month, that's the limit. You'll pay $400 a month for your healthcare minimum. So if that's the store, I don't know what they would prefer rail workers take. The only thing that is like, that you could even say positively about the deal is that it has 24% raises over 4 years, but I mean over 5 years. But if you look at, look at inflation or look at any other union contract, 5% raise a year is just not. This is not a monumental deal. I don't think anyone would say that. Yeah,
5% raise a year right now is a pay cut. And
yes,
and that is the largest, that's the biggest thing that they're pointing to. And Ben Shapiro spent a few minutes in his segment on that, like, oh, wouldn't you love to get a quarter percent, a 25% pay increase or whatever? That's a pay cut over 5 years. That's a pay cut, and he is saying that they got the store, that they got the whole store.
But
I would
Jacob,
also
you can have
just
surgery and not get fired anymore. Like, come on.
Well, it's at certain medical procedures. I don't know.
Oh,
So-
right, maybe. Well,
Let's see.
terms and conditions may apply.
Right. I mean, one other thing I would say about the raises thing is, even if there's one way to think about it is like, okay, it's a pay cut. There's another way to think about it of like, is this a specifically great deal? If you look at just Bureau of Labor Statistics data right now, it's estimated that wages are rising at about 5.4%. That's the latest number I saw. So if you're getting with your deal 5%, that's the whole economy. Wages are rising 5.4%. So this isn't even relative to the other workers in the country. This is not a standout knockdown deal. With John Deere last year, it was a big deal that they got immediate 10% raises. It was both a relative increase from the deal they rejected first and got a second better deal. It was also higher than most people were getting in an annual raise at that time, union or not. And it was also above the rest of the economy in terms of, are you catching up with inflation as of, last September or October. This does not on any metric spell like a magnificent raise increase. The thing they keep saying is this is the highest rail workers have gotten a raise since 40 years ago, which incidentally 40 years ago is when inflation was at this point. So there's no gains here relative to anything else. Now, it's workers' decision if they think that's, is that what they wanted or is it not what they wanted? I don't even have much of a take on that. I just think if you're looking at it economically, if you're looking at it, in any analysis, there's nothing outstanding. This will not go down as a historic rail deal. It'll go down as a historic strike threat, lockout threat, but it won't go down as, nobody's going to be talking about, man, the gains we got in 22. This is not it's not going to change anything. It's not going to be like historic in any way for these workers or for the industry. It's not going to take a cut. It's not going to hurt them that bad, So I just don't think, obviously they got a program to push.
Right. Yeah. So I want to get what are workers? I want to get what workers are telling you. And then I want to get to that about the lockout, about how the strike narrative is kind of complicated by the actual by the facts on the ground. I know that you've got a hard out at 10:30, so I want to make sure that we that we're able to keep moving forward on that. So what are workers telling you? I know that you're getting you and Max and Mel are really kind of at the forefront of, workers are talking to you, coming to you probably more than anybody else. What are workers telling you about how they feel about this deal?
So I'll just say it's very hard to be honest about polling. What does this mean? You have a vocal group that's going to say, I'm feeling strongly this way or the other. But about, maybe 50 to 100 workers who've said something to me maybe two of them have said, I know that I'm voting yes. A really common thing right now is, I have no idea what's in the deal. It doesn't really mean much to say there's some unpaid sick time in the deal. If you can never use it, if it doesn't apply to you, contracts are like legislation, and they're only as useful as they're enforceable. So if it says you can get some unpaid sick time, if that's your contract language, there will be some unpaid sick time. You get 1 day in 5 years of a contract, that's contractually fulfilled. If there's no way to enforce it, if they can deny. One thing I hear from railroad workers all the time is that, yeah, we have this paid time off. They deny it 95% of the time, if you choose X, Y, or Z day. So, I think the main thing people are feeling is we had a strike deadline. We got a deal. We haven't seen the deal. We don't know when we vote on the deal. We don't know when the next strike deadline is if we reject the deal. So, the most thoughtful rail workers I'm talking to, who aren't just in a angry 100% burn it all down mood, which a lot are, is they basically say, like, look, I can't say vote no, I can't say vote yes. None of our leaders have seen it. Literally, it appears from my reporting that national leadership of at least a few of these unions have not seen language on a piece of paper with a signature on it. They've been asking their national unions, can we see it? One of the big unions that was at the bargaining table with the White House or, Secretary of Labor, they put out a release last night, maybe 6 or 7 p.m., that said, if anyone tells you what's in the tentative agreement, they're lying. They haven't seen it. Now, maybe they're accepting their, 10-person negotiation team, but it seems like, I don't know what to say. Is the language actually finalized? Did they have a strict deal in the room, or was it just enough to kick off the strike deadline, the lockout deadline? Clearly, part of the deal was the cooling off period is going to extend, but what the actual language is going to be, it's going to make or break it. And the last thing I'll say is, before the new deal on Thursday, when we got up to the brink, what people's sentiment was, there was internal polling at one of the biggest unions said 78% wanted to vote no and risk it with Congress, basically go on strike or lockout if that's what it's going to take. So the question is, 78%, do you swing whatever it is, like 39% of the vote or whatever you need, how many points, do you swing that with unpaid sick time and a cap on healthcare premiums at $400 a month? Right. I don't see that happening, and I don't see it happening for 10 unions that have yet to ratify, right? So there's a whole situation here with how the vote works, but you actually have here 12 different union contracts. And if one of them is not ratified and hits the strike deadline, they can shut down the whole system with one small union. And that is exactly what happened in 1992, which is the last time there was a national shutdown. So when you talk about, is the rail strike over, you're telling me that all of these 12 unions are going to ratify a deal that they were very far from, a day before, just because they got these honestly seemingly pretty small provisions. I don't buy that they can pass a ratification in every one of these unions, just talking to members. And that doesn't mean there's a strike. That's a separate question. You can reject the deal and still be negotiating. But, just looking at the math, you're not talking about, can they get majority of the railroad workers to support it? They're talking about all these different contracts, all these different issues, a lot of stuff that wasn't addressed, and a lot of built up frustration and anger at the process of how this went down.
Mm-hmm.
Real quick, I wanted to just clarify. We don't know the current cooling off period. It obviously extended, but we don't know for how long, correct?
We have no idea. I mean, presumably that was part of the deal with Secretary of Labor, is they set a date and said, we're going to announce that. There's been multiple different people have told me from different unions what they think it's going to be, as soon as 2 weeks, as long as December. But there has been no official word of, no strike or lockout until XYZ date. And that's a legal, the reason that matters is because it's actually illegal. Under the Railway Labor Act, you set a cooling off period, and that's enforceable by the law. So it means any action before then would be illegal, which brings us, Jacob, to the proto lockout they did the week leading up to the cooling off period, which was stunning.
Well, explain that to us, because there was, like you said, there were proto lockouts by the companies in anticipation of this deadline. And so what we were, as the whole of the media, even outside of the right wing, the echo chamber people, like, we're talking about Bloomberg, New York Times, all these people are talking about the danger that the workers represent. But we were actually seeing bosses moving in a more serious way towards locking out the workers than we were seeing workers moving in a serious way towards striking. Explain that to us.
Well, something you have to understand is how the Railway Labor Act works is that you have this cooling off period. Once that's over, a strike or a lockout is no longer illegal under federal law, which means that either side, the company or the workers, can initiate basically a rail shutdown. Now, why would the company want to do it? Is because historically, under the Rail Labor Act and under rail negotiations, Congress steps in when the rails shut down because it's too much of a national emergency to have the rails not working, that Congress will pass a law. They'll go through both houses of Congress and the president within like 72, 48, 24 hours and pass a law. So the law they're going to pass most likely is going to be based on the recommendations, the Presidential Emergency Board from August, which was the initial recommendations workers were voting on. So if Congress passes it, most likely thing they're going to do is say, you're going back to work under the recommendations that the president's board made in August, which the workers have already said we can't accept. And the carriers,
Right.
the company said we can accept. We're okay with that. So the gamble here from the carriers is basically they think if they can get to a lockout, they can shut down the rails for a short period. Congress will step in and impose the contract that they want, that the unions don't want. And they don't have to bother with these pesky ratification votes or negotiations. It's just over. So they were trying to get to this point. From the workers' perspective, their hope is we can do a strike and it will force the carriers to respond to us, but Congress will stay out or will pass something that's more palatable. They won't just side with the employers. It's a really rare moment where the federal government is directly basically negotiating a union contract. It doesn't happen anywhere else, I mean, except in the federal employees, right? So we, in the week leading up, when Friday is this deadline before which it's illegal to do a strike or lockout, you saw no worker activity in terms of walking off the job, wildcats. I hadn't heard any reports of slowdowns, anything like that. But what you did hear is that rail lines were shutting down operations. Now, they would say there might be a lockout, so we're stopping operations on Tuesday. On Tuesday at noon, we're stopping all Norfolk Southern, a big rail line, stopped all automotive and all intermodal shipments. There was stories of the Biden administration trying to figure out how we're going to get chlorine, hazardous materials that are essential to functioning, how to get chlorine to waste treatment plants just to keep things moving, because the rails were shutting down days before the lockout. Their shutdowns meant that Amtrak had to cancel all these long distance routes. And I had people in the Great Plains in North Dakota saying they hadn't seen a train for days because Amtrak had basically had to shut down because the freight carriers were shutting down, maintenance shutting down, track operations, things like that. So why are they doing that illegally early? Again, they say it's for safety. They say it's for XYZ. But what they want to do is to sort of threaten. This is what a lockout looks like. Look, your economy's slowing down. Congress, you really want to stop car shipments across the whole country? Better step in, better put pressure on the unions to take the deal that's on the table. So that was, to me, scandalous and just another representation of how much power these employers have and how we're relying on, these scrappy working class people to stand up to the most powerful corporation in the country to say, this system isn't working. We desperately need to change something.
Are we expecting that these companies and the people responsible for those for those decisions being made, are we expecting that they are going to be held accountable for breaking the law? I mean, if we saw this on the other end, if we saw unions going out there from the top, not even wildcat strikes are a little bit different and they're maybe a little bit more difficult to hold a union accountable for. But if you get from the top a union going on strike illegally, you could very well be looking at bankrupting a union. All of the fines that would be incurred. Are we expecting anything like that to come to these companies?
Sure, fines, and I don't know the specifics of the Railway Labor Act, but also things like you lose the right to bargain. Like you could just basically, your union no longer exists. There are legal penalties in different jurisdictions. Again, Rail Labor Act, a lawyer could tell you, but serious implications. And I haven't seen anything filed, anything, I don't know what Pete Buttigieg is doing with the Department of Transportation, but you just had, some CEOs and executives shut down maybe it was 5%, maybe it was 10%, maybe 15% of the rail system in this country, specifically for a political gain,
Right.
to say, we don't want to do the sick days, so we're going to give you a taste of what this is going to look like under a legal period where it's stated by presidential action there can be no lockout or stoppage or anything like that. Now, it's just a microcosm of how much power we give corporations to just decide what happens, right? The workers
Right.
have no say in the operations, and they just basically just say, here's what's happening at work today. No car shipments. You can sit in the garage. We're not locking you out technically because you're coming in. We'll still pay you. That's nothing for us, but we're locking out basically the U.S. economy.
Insane. And so we're not you wouldn't even know what the potential penalties would be for these companies, even if someone were to be interested in holding them accountable.
Sure, and I can't imagine, their corporate legal team, I'm sure, is half ex-government officials anyway who work for the Surface Transportation people. So, I don't know. I would love to see someone bring at least some sort of, put a bill in Congress to prosecute this.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.
Which side are you on?